this morning. And I know that some of you, many of you did not come to hear me or Dr. Iverslie, but you came for Dickerson donuts, which were delivered to my office over an hour ago. I told those two custodians when they were in my office to stay out of the donuts. Kim and Bruce, you can't trust them. Speaking of that, some of you may remember Pastor Tim Larson, and we were going to have a memorial service here one day. And I went over to the office and I'm looking for Tim and couldn't find him. I worked on the Bethany Hall and I couldn't find him. I heard some noise in the kitchen. So I turned the light on and there he was, rummaging through the cupcakes and the flowers and everything for the funeral. Can you believe it? So, in the scriptures, it's quite interesting if you make comparisons of the crucifixion story. The Gospel of Mark treats the crucifixion in quite a different way, as opposed to Luke, who was a physician, which we'll hear more about today. But Mark was more objective. It's like, here's kind of what happened. And Luke goes into more details. So let me read a portion of the crucifixion, which we will, if you will, observe and honor this Thursday night, Maundy Thursday, as well as Good Friday. Two others also were criminals, were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place where it's just called the skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right and one on the left. And Jesus said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And they cast lots to divide his garments, and the people stood by watching. But the ruler scoffed at him, saying, He saved others, let him save himself, if he is Christ, God, his chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him vinegar and saying, If you are king of the Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him, This is the King of the Jews. One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, Are you not Christ? Save yourself and us. But the other rebuked him, saying, Do not fear God, since you are under the silence and condemnation. And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And he said to him, Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. That is from Luke chapter 23. Some thoughts about that. Oftentimes the crucifixion story is referred to as the Passion. That is a name given by theologians, the Passion, the suffering and death of Christ. It's quite interesting as we look at the story in more detail. It has political implications and it has theological implications. There was a great deal of mistrust and misinformation during those days about who Jesus was. Jesus was trying to establish a spiritual kingdom. And Herod and Pilate and the Roman authorities thought that he was trying to take over an earthly kingdom, a political kingdom. They were confused by all of this. Jesus wanted nothing to do with the designing of a government or earthly kingdom. He was here for the purpose that God sent him in order to suffer, to die, and to rise again. But what's interesting in the Luke version of his suffering and death about how Jesus did not resist. He could have resisted. He could have perhaps turned all this around because he was the Son of God, but he didn't. He was very docile, if you will, in all of this. He was obedient even to death. Keep in mind, in the stories, they beat him. They gave him vinegar when he was thirsty to drink. There was no resistance, and he never fought back. Obedient for the cause of death. And Luke is very, very implicit about this. And because he was a physician, he knew something about that. The political was, they really thought he was trying to take over. And they resisted. It's interesting as you look at Herod and Pilate, who did not like each other at the very beginning. They were struggling for power. It says they became friends and colleagues throughout this because they had a common goal, and that was to make Jesus suffer and to die. And part of the story I read was Jesus was hung between two criminals. His death could have been done much easier. Even though very vulgar, they could have hung him, they could have shot him, they could have stabbed him. They wanted to make his death the most miserable death possible in that society. The most embarrassing thing they possibly could do in front of his family, in front of his people who were there to observe. They did every possible thing, called him names. Save yourself, do whatever. And those kinds of torture elements of hanging on the cross, putting nails through your hands and through your feet, watching somebody bleed to death, begging for something to drink, and they put a sponge of vinegar on his lips, which makes you even more thirsty. The point of all this is he was willing, out of love, out of commitment, out of the mission that God had given him, to suffer and to die according to the scriptures. This was not all made up. This was prophesied. It was prophesied in the Old Testament in various passages. And now in the Gospel of Luke, as we read about it, this in fact is what happened. What's instructive in this is the two criminals. Two bad dudes who had done a lot of bad things. They too were placed alongside of them. And one of them said, why are you here? We didn't do anything wrong. They recognized it. And the other one said, remember me when you get into paradise. And Jesus said, truly today you will be with me in paradise. Immediate forgiveness and reconciliation right there on the cross. A change of heart. The Lenten Passion story has many stories, many themes, but the basic fundamental theme of it is that God in Jesus obeyed the command of God, why he was sent here to this earth some 2,000 years ago. Jesus did not want to get up in the political, get it caught in the political. He was here about the spiritual. And that was to complete the mission that God had sent him. In the book of Mark, to make a comparison, there's three things about the crucifixion that's stated in Mark that's not stated in Luke. First, Jesus cried out as he died. That's what it says, he cried out. Number two, the temple curtain was torn in two upon his death. And thirdly, the centurion confessed, this must have been the Son of God. That is in the book of Mark, not in the book of Luke. And so to get a complete, full understanding of the passion story, the crucifixion, it is good to take the Gospels and put them side by side and look at the story of the crucifixion. As people were watching, what were some of them doing? They were gambling, they were rolling dice for his clothes. Again, as disheartening, as dishonorable as you possibly could think. There's somebody screaming, begging, suffering, and they're gambling. They're not paying attention to what's occurring. Maybe that's somewhat true today at times. We're not paying attention. But God was able to all of this, and ultimately the words, he said, it is finished. I have completed what God has asked me to do by hanging on the cross and dying. So with that, I'm going to offer a prayer, and then I'll introduce Dr. Iverslie. Lord, we thank you for allowing us to think back some 2,000 years ago when you were born and you completed the mission that God sent you to do. That is to preach, teach, but ultimately to suffer and die, rise again on that first Easter, which gives all of us hope for the future. Lord, for each of those who are gathered here today to further understand the Passion story, be inspired by the Holy Spirit, to hear deeper meanings of the Gospel of Book of Luke, we thank you for each of them. Lord, we ask that you bless their families, keep them from harm and danger and illness. Lord, in this week of Monday, Thursday, and Good Friday, and ultimately Easter, grant us a time of meditation, a time of hope, a time of reflection, a time when your Holy Spirit will enter into the minds and hearts of each of us. We thank you now for this day that you have given to us, the hopes and the signs of spring. Lord, this day we do remember the people of Croatia and the people of Ukraine and the people of Russia. Lord, for they have suffered and continue to suffer in time of war. Hear our prayers. Grant peace in the world among God's people. Amen. This morning, we're privileged to have with us Dr. Phil Iverslie. Let me tell you a little story about Dr. Iverslie. It's even true. Our first year here in 1973, Dr. Floyd Lean, or Pastor Floyd Lean, and I worked together. And in those days, Wilbur was growing rather rapidly in population. And part of that, the Wilbur Chamber of Commerce provided all the pastors called a welcome wagon. How they got this information, I don't know. If you moved into town, every preacher and priest and rabbi in this town knew it. Okay? We got a piece of paper, so-and-so. Pastor Lean said to me, Dean, I have a meeting I have to go to. There's a new doctor living out by Eagle Lake Church. Will you go out and visit them? Oh, good. Just what I want to do, visit a doctor. You know, I just out of seminary, whatever. So I drive up on this beautiful day, and there's a car or two in the parking lot in the driveway. I didn't think much of it, and knocked on the door, and God rest her soul, Phil's wife, Ferline, was there. Says, oh, come on in. She says, nice to see you. She says, Pastor Mueller from Vinci is here visiting too. I thought about that many times. Could she have said, just come back again? So here I am, 23, 24 years old, and here's his pastor. Now, some of you don't remember Pastor Mueller, but he was, the old German term, Herr Pastor. He was the pastor in the community and well respected and all. And he's sitting there talking with Phil, whatever. And I'm thinking, I'm just nervous. What do I do? How do I get out of here? They had 4 children. And I looked over at the children, and Carl, your oldest, he had a little ball in his hand. I said, you like to play ball? Yeah. Out the back door we went, and there I'm out there playing catch with the kids. And the doctor and his wife were in there with the Herr Pastor talking theology. Well, he finally left, thank God. Your dear wife invited us in for lemonade. I remembered, so we sat there, and I'm mumbling and stumbling for words. And I said, I'd like to invite you to Calvary. And whatever. Well, they did come to Calvary and subsequently joined. And I always think about that story and have confirmed as children, officiate baptism, so on and so forth. That's how I got to know Phil Iverslie. Some of you know Dr. Iverslie as your doctor. I would tell you this. Never heard a bad word about Phil Iverslie. Take that to the bank. Never a bad word as a physician or as a person. That's something. Dr. Iverslie practiced medicine in Minneapolis, St. Paul for 10, 11 years. He came to Wilmer, practiced for about 22 years. He's a graduate of St. Olaf College and yes, the University of Minnesota Medical School. And so we're very pleased to have him talk this morning, if you will, the medical conditions of Jesus and how crucifixion and all that happened. Dr. Iverslie passion is hunting, fishing, and that's very good. Not only he's a parishioner, but he's a friend. And of course, we remember his dear wife, who was president of this congregation some years ago, and I'll remember her warmly. So with that, you're done with a third of the program. It's me, and you're going to have Dr. Iverslie. No, Connie, I did not take 2 donuts. Somebody else is in there. Well, maybe I did. So, Dr. Phil Iverslie, welcome to this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean. I didn't expect the introduction, but I have to say that I think part of the reason, maybe a big reason we came to Calvary was because of Pastor. Yesterday, I was here when Pastor Dean had his adult forum, and sitting next to me was John Davis, and John said he was going to come. And my understanding, I think when I talked to Carolyn, that there were about a dozen people, 15 women that were going to come here, and John said he was going to come, and I said, I think this is a woman's Bible study. And then I thought, why did I say such a dumb thing? But when I was sitting down, there was still a little gap in time, and I thought to myself how things have changed and how different things were in my life, and being thankful that I grew up when I did and I was in medicine when I did. I've always said I got in a good time, got out of a good time. And then I thought how different it is now, and I thought, Kelly, could it happen that a doctor would deliver a baby now and go out to the waiting room and congratulate the husband and have the father say, is it a boy or a girl? And the doctor say, I don't know. That's where we're at. But crucifixion is much more serious. And it's a hard thing to study. It's a hard thing to talk about. And I hope it's not terribly hard to hear about this, because it's not an easy subject. This started about 13 years ago when I was at men's Bible study here, and I was asked why I thought Jesus died on the cross. And I didn't have a good answer, but I was excited about that concept, and I wanted to learn more about crucifixion. And so I studied that the best I could. And the first thing is, of course, to read the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because there was a lot of discussion of crucifixion in that. But I was interested in the medical part too, and being able to answer the question of why did Jesus die. I had a friend, Dr. Jack Swanson. He was a pathologist at the Swedish hospital where I was before I came here. He was a very good Christian. He was a very smart, and he was a friend. And I called him on the phone and thought maybe he could help me. And he told me about an article that had been in the Journal of the American Medical Association, and it's titled "On the Physical Death of Jesus Christ." And I was able to recover that article. I meant to mention too that besides being a doctor, Dr. Swanson was a musician, and I still have his obituary. He died in 2017, and for 33 years he was the organist at Normandale Lutheran Church in Edina, and he also, I knew, attended the Luther Seminary not as a student but as a visitor to just learn more about his faith. And this article has been very helpful. It was written by a physician from the Mayo Clinic, a pathologist, and there was other people, several Methodist pastors who were part of this. But the references, there's 40 references, and a lot of detail. And he went back to the writings of Christians and non-Christians as far back as he could go. And crucifixion began in Persia, and Persia no longer exists, and now that's the country of Iran, which still is not one of our friends. And crucifixion actually was taking place about 500 years before Christ, and it spread from Persia to Egypt to Carthage and then on to Rome. And what I'm going to do is explain the best I can how crucifixion occurred in Rome at the time of Jesus. And crucifixion was intended, as Pastor Dee mentioned, to be a very traumatic and degrading and embarrassing death, as well as excruciating pain and a long suffering death. The word excruciating comes from a Latin word that means out of the cross. And by law, the first step was to be whipped. And the Bible talks about scourging and flogging, instead of using the word whipping. But women were not crucified, and the convicted then was stripped of his clothes and tied by his hands to a flogging post. And the whipping was primarily on the back, the buttocks, and the legs. And there'd be 4 Roman soldiers and a centurion. The 1 or 2 of the Roman soldiers would do the whipping. They'd have a short handled wooden whip with varying lengths of leather thongs on the whip, and sewed to the leather would be little metal balls, and also sharp fragments of cheekbones. And the steel balls would cause progressive bruising and contusions into the skin, and the cheekbones would lacerate the skin through the subcutaneous tissue and into the muscle. And besides being terribly, terribly painful, there would be significant bleeding with this. The next step then was to go to the site of the crucifixion, which is usually on the edge of the city. And the tradition, and we read in the Bible how the convicted would carry the cross, but actually it wasn't the entire cross. The cross would weigh 300 or more pounds. And so it was only the crossbar that was carried. This was called the tibulum, and it was 5 to 6 feet long, and it would be placed across the nape of the neck and across the shoulders, and then the outstretched arms and the elbows would be tied to the crossbar. At the site of the soldiers would accompany them to the crucifixion site, and one of the soldiers would carry a sign that said the name of the convicted and and also the crime that he'd been accused of. At the at the site of the crucifixion, the vertical post would be in place. It was a big log post. It was 7 to 8 feet tall, very rough surface on it. And the convicted would be offered a drink of this bitter wine, as Pastor Dean mentioned, with myrrh. And myrrh is the sap or the resin from a bush. And then the convicted would be thrown onto his back, and we read that the hands were nailed to the crossbar. Actually, the nails, and these aren't nails like we think of nails, they were spikes that were 5 to 7 inches long. And the nailing was through the wrist, not into the palm. The reason being that because of the weight of the body, if the nail was through the hand, it would strip through the hand and it wouldn't be able to hold the body. So the actual nailing was done at the wrist, and there's 8 little carpal bones there, and those are the ligaments. That was sufficient enough then to hold the convicted onto the cross. There's a well-known, the median nerve goes through the hand. And that's the nerve, as you know, is involved in carpal tunnel syndrome. And that nerve would usually be severed or traumatized in some way. And with that, any motion of the hand, there'd be shooting pains that would go up the arm. Then the Roman soldiers would lift up the condemned and the crossbar and attach it to the stipes, which is the name of the post. There were 2 types of crosses. Well, I should say there were more kinds of crosses. At that, there was even an X cross in varying heights. The cross that we know so well in our faith is called the Latin cross, where the crossbar is below the top of the cross. But there was also, and I think the pronunciation is two, but it's spelled T-A-U, and that's the letter T in the Greek alphabet. And in that cross, the crossbar is placed on top of the post. It's not really known what type of cross was used in Jesus. I'll mention that later. Yet quite a people die on the cross. The best answer is suffocation or asphyxia. And normal breathing, there's an active and a passive phase. In the active phase, our chest muscles open up our chest, air is drawn into our lungs. The exhalation is passive, and it's a relaxation of the chest returns. So it's breathing in, breathing out, breathing in, breathing out. Because of the weight of the body on the cross, this is reversed. The inhalation is really locked in an open position, so it's a passive position. And the problem is the convicted then can breathe in, but because his lungs are open, he can't exhale. And to do that, he'd have to pull up with his arms and push up with his feet to lift his body up so that he could expire the air. And that's where you come into the cause of death. And that's why I needed this help from this, because this medicine, of course, it was still primitive at the time of Jesus. And there's nothing in the Bible that really tells us about that. But after some time, the person would really run out of steam, so to speak, where he couldn't breathe anymore, and he would suffocate and die. There's other factors that enter in, and I'll mention to that. But at times, they wanted to speed up the time of death, and one of the Roman soldiers would take a metal bar and break the lower leg, the tibia and the fibula, the lower legs, below the knee. And when that happened, then the person could no longer lift themselves up to exhale and would die within minutes. But that wasn't quite enough. The Roman soldier would then be trained to, which we know as a spear in the side, to take a spear, and it was actually passed on the right side between the ribs, and it would go then through the lung and into the heart. And I'll come back to this, but this is where in Paul that speaks about in John it speaks about the flow of blood and water. It's not quite right, but I'll explain that. So this is a terrible thing to go through, and it's just unbelievable. I wanted to add that crucifixion ended in the year 337 AD for Rome, when Emperor Constantine ruled that the official religion of Rome was Christianity. Now, as far as Jesus is the Son of God, but he had a human birth, so he was flesh and blood, just like we are. And this time was coming. Jesus knew this, and he mentioned this is on a Thursday. This article actually thought it was in figuring out when they had the Passover time and so on. It was actually on April 7th or April 6th for Thursday. And besides Maundy Thursday, more came. Jesus instructed the disciples how to find the upper room in Jerusalem, which is on the southwest corner of Jerusalem. And there they had, it was Maundy Thursday, and then the Passover supper, which was also the last supper, and then the first sacrament of Holy Communion. And following that, I guess there's a Kidron Valley that Jesus and the disciples went. They went to the Mount of Olives and then to Gethsemane. And there, Jesus, just the disciples were with him. He told them to stay here. And I think it's in Luke. I hope I'm right on that. I didn't have time to write it in here. But it was interesting. I think it was Luke said that the distance that Jesus separated from the disciples was a stone's throw. But there he was under extreme anxiety and anxious, and he knew what was going to happen, and he prayed with extreme passion and anxiousness. And that's when Luke describes that there was bloody sweat. And Pastor D mentioned Luke was a physician. A little after midnight, now this would be then Good Friday, Jesus was arrested, and he knew this was coming. That's what was the problem with the stress that he had at that time. And he had, I believe it was 3 Jewish trials and 3 Roman trials. The Jews did not have the power to, the Jewish authorities didn't have the power to sentence someone to death, to crucifixion. But at any rate, after those Jewish trials, he was convicted of, charged with blasphemy. The first Roman trial was with Pontius Pilate, and Pilate, as we know, did not find reason to sentence him. And then he went to Herod. As Pastor Dean mentioned, they were enemies, became friends, but Herod, same deal, came back to Pilate for the 3rd time. And I think before that, actually, Jesus had been flogged or whipped. And at that point, as far as it was about 9 o'clock on Thursday night, when he was with the Last Supper, and then about 12 hours later, then 9 o'clock or so in the morning, when he was flogged. At that point, he was weakened before even being flogged because he'd been up all night, he hadn't slept, he hadn't had anything to drink, he had nothing further to eat. And in all these trials going back and forth, there was about 2.5 miles or more that he had to walk. So he wasn't in good shape to begin with. He'd been beaten in the Jewish trials, some beating and mocking at the flogging site, and he had a crown of thorns put on his head, as you know. There was some bleeding from that, of course, but the bleeding from that was not thought to be excessive enough to really get him into trouble. But he also had a purple robe put on. When that was taken off of him, it probably stuck to all the blood that he'd had from his flogging, and would have been painful in itself. And again, he was beaten and mocked. And at that point, still, Pilate was hesitant to sentence him, and the Bible even says, I think this is in Matthew, that he washed his hands of this. And the crowd that was there, as you know, demanded crucifixion, and finally Pilate turned over Jesus over to the crowd. And the flogging, if I go back to that, had been very severe. We had extreme amount of bleeding, and he was very weakened from that to begin with. And then the Bible mentions carrying the cross, but as I mentioned, it was only the crossbar. And Jesus, as you know, did not have the stamina to carry that crossbar. So Simon of Cyrene apparently was forced to carry the crossbar, and the distance from the site of the flogging to Golgotha, which was called the place of the skull, was about a third of a mile, 600 to 650 yards. And Jesus, after the flogging, his clothes were put back on him at Golgotha. The clothes were removed. Apparently, he just had a loincloth on at that point. And he tasted the bitter wine, but he refused it. And he was crucified and put on the cross. As I said, this article says they aren't really certain what style of cross that was. Both of them were used at the time, and there's arguments to say it's this one or that one, but we don't know for sure. On the cross, he spoke 7 different chimes, and this article points out that our speech really is an expiration. So that had to be a huge effort for him to exhale. And Pastor Dean mentioned how at the end he gave out a cry and his head bowed and he was felt to be dead. But as again, Pastor Dean mentioned, there was a thief on his right and on his left. And this now is getting to be dusk at Friday, and Saturday was the Sabbath for the Jews. They did not want somebody on the cross at the time of Sabbath. And they requested to Pilate, who was the Roman governor of Judea, that the bones be broken. So they were broken on the 2 thieves, but when it came to Jesus, they decided that he was already dead. So they did not break his legs. But it was a routine procedure, as I mentioned, for a soldier to pass the spear. And a little more detail on that, is basically a sack around the lungs, a pleural sack, lining the chest wall and the lungs. And you've heard of a pleural effusion where fluid will accumulate in the pleural space. And then when you get into the heart, it was lies through the right side of the heart muscles. The heart is really a muscle, it's just a pump. And the musculature is greater on the left side than the right side. So if the spear went into this sac, there can be a pericardial effusion, fluid in the chest, in the sac along the heart, so to speak, and then into the heart, which would, of course, cause a great deal of bleeding. And so that was done on Jesus. And the question that I started with is, why did he die? Well, I mentioned this dysphagia, this exhaustion of dysphagia is what they always describe it. And also they mention hypovolemic shock. In other words, he bled so much that he was then shocky from that, and his condition was so bad that contributed to it. And they say that most crucifixions, there were multiple things that could be involved, and not just one single thing. They speculated on different things: a heart attack, heart failure, an arrhythmia, a rupture of the heart. But of course, the big question isn't why, but whether did Jesus truly die on the cross. And of course, that's the basis of our Christian faith. And had that not happened, that would it would mess up our, that's not the right word, it would mess up our beliefs as we've been taught. And the medical experts that talked about this, the agreement is that everything considered, the people writing this article and before, the conclusion is that indeed Jesus was dead when he was taken off the cross. A couple more things talking about the Bible and what I've said here. The sweat that Luther talks about, that Luke talks about with bloody sweat, I never heard of that, but apparently that is something that really occurs, and there's actually a medical term for that. But that apparently, under extreme anxiety and stress, the blood vessels can rupture, that the blood would go into the sweat glands, and so that is something that indeed can and does happen, although not very often. The scars in the hands, Jesus, of course, mentioned to Thomas and others, his disciples, look at my hands. And I mentioned it's not through the hands, it's through the wrist. But at that time, and things have changed a lot, but at that place and this time, currently, anatomically, the wrist was considered part of the hand. So that's consistent. The spear through the side, and people have said, well, maybe it was abdominal and there was ascites, fluid in the belly, and that fluid that John talks about was fluid from the abdomen, or maybe it was even a rupture of the urinary bladder. But again, the word, the translation, the Bible wasn't written in English, of course, and that the bleeding, this spear was from the chest, and the word that was used for that actually implied the chest in the pleura. So that part is ruled out. And lastly, John mentions the flow of blood and water. And obviously, if this was blood and water, maybe it should have said water and blood, because that would have Lenten, and they apparently went by volume rather than the sequence. And so there obviously would have been a lot more blood if the heart was perforated. There'd be a lot more blood than it was water. And so that is consistent also. So if there's any questions, I'll try to answer them. I don't expect a lot, so that's okay. Yeah, it's not tough, but I appreciate being asked to do this. I told John I'd rather do tonsillectomy than be up here. But anyway, it's a privilege to be here, and thank you.
Somebody must have some questions.
Thank you, Doctor, for an explanation and insight into the medical crucifixion, if you will. Any questions that you have? Any questions? Yes, Sally. Why did Jesus die before the soldiers is the question.
I don't think they probably paid attention to it. That wasn't mentioned. And one thing I forgot to say is I mentioned the average time on the cross was several days, 2 to 4 days. And sometimes it would be hours. And Jesus died in they thought between 3 and 6 hours. They aren't really sure of that. But even Pilate wondered why he died so fast. And again, it's because his condition was so bad to begin with. I can't really, I don't have a good answer to the question. I'll have to look at it.
Any more questions?
On that same regards then, if they were gonna take them down before the Sabbath, there wasn't enough time then for the robbers.
You know, I'm sorry, being mentioned, I like to hunt, and I hunt cans for 6 years, and my hearing is terrible.
Why don't you come up here, Phil, and we'll, again, Darlene, what's your question?
Well, if there was that small window of time, and it was the Sabbath, and they hadn't died yet, Jesus did, and the other two had not. And then they broke their legs, was that
Well,
encouraged?
yeah, they broke the legs of the thieves because they wanted to hurry the death so they could get them off the cross. They got permission to do that from, maybe I didn't say this, from Pilate, and because they didn't want a body on the cross for their Sabbath. As I mentioned, that started in.
I caught that.
Yeah.
Why does just broken legs hurry the death?
Why does it?
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, maybe I didn't explain that. I thought I did, but maybe at that point, when the legs
Maybe
are
you
broken,
did.
you can't lift yourself up. You stop breathing, and with that, you die within minutes. And so I don't think the soldiers knew when this order came out to break the legs. They probably had the Jews asked for that, and it was granted by Pilate, and so they did it on the. And again, it was close to sundown, maybe about. It was in the evening, as we know, and this crucifixion, I'm sure, was unique. The timing, God probably planned that. So Thursday, Friday, and so on. And of course, other crucifixions were done on such a timing as we know here. And so often the body was just left on the cross. Okay.
More questions, comments? I know we're standing here between donuts, but you can't have donuts till 10 o'clock, right? It's 5 too. Huh? I can just see them. Any more questions? Yeah, Pastor Ron.
We don't hear about what did they push up on?
Well, here it, and I didn't mention that because they don't know if that was ever Jesus or not, but at some point they did have a little block beneath the feet. And also one that they could, a little block that they could sit on. But whether that was present with Jesus, we don't know. But the terrible thing about this is your feet are nailed. And so you didn't need to be on that and to lift yourself up. You can imagine the pain that you have with that, with both your hands and your arms and your feet. But for that, it was see the feet were really locked into that post by the spike. So I think they actually use that seat and those little blocks for the feet to prolong the death. And that was they weren't trying to make this a nice thing. They wanted it to be as terrible as it could be. It's terrible enough without that.
Any more questions? Marcia, Carolyn, announcements that you have before we, you're going to meet next week?
Yes.
And the subject matter is?
We have a little list, things of last week before tomorrow that the gals here last week haven't done yet. But you're welcome to take part in this. It's the events of Holy Week, Sunday, Easter. I'll have this out. Scripture reference.
Are these folks invited back next week and the week after? Huh? Rodney wants to, will there be donuts? I saw a couple of the male species peeking around the corner here early, like, are we invited? You know, kind of thing. I'm not getting into discrimination, who's invited and who's not. All are invited in God's house, okay? We'll just leave it at that. Anything else before you want a break for coffee and donuts and conversation? Is that the plan? And again, Phil, thank you very much. When I was listening to you talk, by the way, you never looked at your notes. You forgot to look at your notes. I think back of the doctors of your day, you know, that I got to know while visiting the hospital, Dr. Monarchy, and you know, on and on and on. Some great physicians that we enjoyed here in Wilmer. Some of you remember Dr. Monarchy. He was a character. God rest his soul. He was the county coroner, and I was on call from time to time down at the hospital in the ER, along with other pastors. And there had been a very bad accident. And it was a Saturday night. There had been alcohol involved. There was fatalities. But some of the survivors were still there on gurneys, and it was not a good scene. And this gentleman was rattling and carrying on something terrible. And I don't know if this was learned in medical school or not. Dr. Monarchy went over to him and said, "You shut up, or I'm going to have him sew your lips shut." About 1 o'clock in the morning, I go, Bill, come up here to the mic. You've got something to say.
I remember Pastor Tim Larson many years ago gave a talk. I've got a funny memory. I can remember things that aren't terribly important. At any rate, I remember Pastor Tim Larson saying a quote of Lou Holtz, the football coach. Somebody asked Lou Holtz, "What scares you?" And the answer was not being prepared. And so I've always tried to live by that.
Well, let's give Dr. Iverslie. Thank you very much. Okay, yes. It's being recorded. Can we put it on the website? Give it to Sheila and she put it on. And you will go worldwide. And some of your former colleagues will say, look at him. He's still, he's a very unassuming gentleman, I'll tell you. He has a little hunting shack over here, and Pastor Larson and I were invited and whatever, but we talk about this, and I'm not telling